Hi. We could not really leave this tutorial without at least briefly discussing a topic that is often encountered, but missing in the original works of machine ethics, which is somewhat funny because the first thing we should ask ourselves when we are talking about automating moral decision making is whose morality should be used in order to emulate or implement in a machine. Now, this set of slides is about the role that social choice can play in machine ethics, particularly in determining whose values or whose obligations should be taken into consideration. When I was introducing moral philosophy, I said a moral theory is an explanation of what makes a choice good. I said it can be seen as a reasoning system that can be used to establish the righteousness of a choice given what the available options are and what we know about what is good and bad. And I said that this information on what is good and bad typically comes back either as values that should be followed or moral obligations that should be followed. But I did not say whose values and whose obligations are the ones that should be considered. Now, when the moral agent is a person, then obviously it is the values and obligations of that person that the person should use when they are doing moral reasoning. But when the agent that is doing the moral reasoning is a machine, this is not a simple decision to make. That these have to come somewhere from the outside of the autonomous system. So from where? Further to the point, when I was discussing some specific theories, there were some underspecified issues there. So in ethical egoism, I briefly discussed that we need to decide whose best interests should the machine be following. And of course, the problem exists for both machines and for humans in utilitarianism, which looks to maximize the overall good everyone considered, or the overall balance between good and evil everyone considered. How do you align? How do you compare somebody's good with somebody's bad, right? So you need to make some kind of a social decision as to what it means that something is good for a group of people, given how good it is or how bad it is for individuals in that group. So the unavoidable decision in machine ethics is which values or obligations should be used by the machine that does moral reasoning. It is, of course, which reasoning system should be used as well, but these are choices that we cannot avoid making here. Now, when we're talking about morality of humans, moral philosophy is okay to be in the state in which it is. I mean, when we are making moral decisions, we do not necessarily, as individuals, fall back on some kind of a moral theory. Very often we follow our gut. We say, yeah, this was a good decision because it felt good, and we have empathy among each other, and we can explain to each other as to why we did something that we did, right? We don't really need a system here. And even in systems such as formal moral theories, often there are these implicit assumptions about intentions and values and obligations that are being available to the agent that is doing the moral reasoning, which we cannot fall back on here. The other thing is that we cannot really leave that decision of whose values or whose obligations to the engineers who are implementing machine reasoning, machine ethics reasoning system. This is not because people are inherently evil or that we are afraid necessarily that some evil engineer will put bad values or bad obligations into a machine, but is more to the point that certain options and certain choices do not appear to be moral choices. So one can make small design decisions that may have bigger impact later on, bring about bad moral decisions as a consequence. This is something that we would like analyzed and discussed perhaps as a society, and the decision of whose values and obligations should be used or whose reasoning system should be used should be one that is made by social choice. Now, there exists something I have to mention. This is not it, but it should be mentioned because it sounds similar. There exists something called social contract theory in moral philosophy. It's also known as contractarianism. Sorry, this is unpronounceable. What does contractarianism say? So it says that morality arises from a social construct that self-interested and rational people would abide by in order to secure a degree of peace, prosperity, and safety. So it tells us where does morality come from, in a way. And it basically says, yes, it can come from people agreeing that we will hold this to be our value, we will hold this to be our obligation, and this is what we're going to follow as a group, which makes sense in machine ethics very much. It is due to Hobbes, I should mention, and he claimed that to enforce the social contract rules, what is needed is a fierce and powerful person or persons to enforce the rules, to threaten punishment, and to deliver it swiftly to rule breakers. Right? So social contract theory tells us that morality can't be decided by a social contract. So this is something that is not unusual in moral philosophy. It's something that is considered, but it does not really tell us how people can reach this decision. And the worry in human moral decision makers that there is no way to enforce this morality because it comes somehow from the outside, beautifully is actually not a worry in machine ethics, because machines are programmed by us to do what we say they should do. So there is that powerful person or persons to enforce the rules. So social contract theory exists, but it does not solve the problem of how to decide collectively on values and obligations that should be implemented in machine ethics. There exists one work that I have found, which you can see here, which makes a very beautiful analysis of the problem of deciding together on which values and obligations should be used when building an artificial intelligence, specifically they say here, but I can generalize it and say when building autonomous systems, when building in machine ethics. So this is the paper called Social Choice Ethics in Artificial Intelligence by Seth Baum, and you can find it following these credentials. So I would like to just bring out the highlights from this work. What does it mean to agree on values and obligations? So as Baum specifies, to agree on values or obligations, there are in fact three collective decisions that we should make. The first one is who has standing, namely who should have their values or obligations factored into the AI. He speaks of an AI. What procedure is used to obtain values and obligations from those who have standing? And lastly, how are the values or individuals combined to form the aggregated ethical views of society? Now, Baum goes into detail in each of these issues, but I will give you the short version. If you're interested, of course, please do read the paper. So the problem of who has standing is a very interesting one. And I personally didn't consider this to be very important until I read Baum's paper. But if you think about it, when we do social choice politically in our society, in elections, who can vote, the electorate is a very clearly defined group of people. Now, if you are considering who should be deciding which values and obligations should go into an artificial intelligence system, then it is, we need to do this. We need to define who is allowed to vote, as it were. Now, the first thing is to say, well, everyone that is a stakeholder, everyone that is affected somehow or involved in the making of an artificial intelligence system should get a vote, right? So this would include manufacturers, users, owners, society. And this seems simple enough, presuming that you can somehow identify all the possible users and all the possible owners and somehow figure out who speaks for society. Should you take every person who is a citizen in a society or a resident in a society or a person who has lived in a particular society for a particular period of time? Is it people who are allowed to cast a political vote in a political election? Are those the same people who represent society, or should we consider other people who don't have the right to vote necessarily? But further beyond that point, we have to recognize that what we are doing here is some kind of a social contract, and what is okay for a machine to do, basically which values and obligations should the machine follow, is something that can be decided today. And we say, okay, today this is good enough for a machine. But things change, and often things that were not really considered to be okay in the past are considered to be okay now, and vice versa. Just think about littering, for example. So littering was far better tolerated before 1970s, 80s even than it is today, when it's right out immoral to litter anywhere. So there needs to be some kind of a flexible definition of who the electorate is, right? So parents of today cannot be deciding, for example, of 2 generations of descendants from today, what should be the morality that machines that they may still be using should implement. So this is not a simple decision to make, and it is one that has to be approached with perhaps the same seriousness with which we approach the problem of who is allowed to vote in an election. Now, there is the issue of the elicitation procedure. In elections, there is a ballot with options, and you are told what to do with it. So typically, it is select one candidate, circle one candidate that you want to be the winner of the election, or rank these candidates in some kind of a strict order that may not be total. When it comes to getting opinions, eliciting opinions of which values should the machine follow, or which obligations it should follow, how should we get this input, right? This is not a trivial problem. There are more values and obligations out there than there are candidates on a ballot. Should we ask people to directly rank values? Now, there is the issue here of framing, for example. There are many issues because people are susceptible to the presentation of the options, and they also have limited attention span, limited interest. Something may not seem important at the time when the decision is being made, so they can even act not on their self-interest when they're voting. We know, for example, that fire alarms are very important, and that one should keep the batteries in a fire alarm always fresh and replaced and working, right? But if an alarm goes off, so if a warning goes off somewhere at 3 a.m. and asks you to input new batteries, and this is for your best good, if this is a bad time for you, you're sleeping, you're tired, and you're much more likely to knock off the fire alarm with an instrument of your choice than you are to go rummaging through the night to replace the batteries right then and there. So this is a concern, right here. This is a concern that if there is too many values, too many obligations, that people will not be interested in giving you a direct rank or reading all of them to choose from them, and you may not actually get the input that you need. So to account for such situations, we can maybe consider the possibility to deduce the values of a person by, for example, gamifying the elicitation methods. This is what Moral Machines was exploring, whether it's doable. There are many works that I'm aware of, but I'm not sure whether they're published yet, in which people explore the option of presenting people with interesting game-like scenarios in which they have to make moral decisions. And then based on these moral decisions, then we extrapolate that these are the values that people are actually following, and these are the obligations they actually want to be followed. Noisy data problems everywhere, so I don't need to really go into discussing this. But I should mention that there is also the option of extrapolating the choices of people from their earlier choices. So ask people to play a game or to somehow in other ways supply their choices on what values and obligations we want, and then use this information to then predict what values and obligations they would be interested in the future, right? So this is a paper that specifically follows this path. It's not specifically about choosing ethical values and obligations, but is closest to the task that I have encountered. Again, this is also not a simple problem, and some that requires a lot of care and attention, possibly as much as what we give to, let's say, how doctors elicit information from patients, or how in a political campaign you elicit, specifically for the framing problem, how should you organize the options? How do you not overwhelm the person who is supposed to give you the information that you want? And lastly is the problem of how to aggregate information. Social choice theory has one lesson to teach us, that is that an ideal aggregation method does not exist. This is Kenneth Arrow. He is the one who mathematically basically showed us that an ideal aggregation method does not exist. Now, the question then is, what can we live without when it comes to aggregating opinions of values and obligations that should be followed. Does it make sense to take a majoritarian-based rule, to follow the will of the majority here? Now, majoritarianism seems like a very good idea when we are aggregating preferences, for instance, but one has to observe that majoritarianism only works as long as everyone in the electorate, however you defined it, has a chance to at one point be part of the majority, right? But if, let's say, for instance, we decide today on what all driverless cars should implement as values or obligations, right? And this decision cannot be changed afterwards, or not easily changed afterwards, or we have not specified how this decision should be changed afterwards, then majoritarianism can very much be a tyranny, right? If you are a minority group, if you are even two people that have somehow a different opinion of values and obligations, your opinions will never be considered. You will be basically disenfranchised. So we do not want, right? We do not want to accidentally use some social choice method for aggregating values and obligations, pretending that people have impact on what are the moral decisions that machines can make, but then accidentally disenfranchise people by doing that, locking them into a will of a majority to which they can never be a part of. So then the question, of course, is what properties should a social choice aggregator satisfy for it to be adequate to aggregate these values? Are these the same properties that we want if what we are aggregating are actually obligations? So all of these are questions that we do not have answer to. And we have more questions to which we don't have answer to. And I refer to you to the next video for the final conclusion of this tutorial.